Welcome to Piloting the Future, a podcast brought to you by InnovationForce and EE Online. Here on Piloting the Future, we're going deep with the leaders, innovators, and forward thinkers responsible for not just imagining where our power future is headed, but they're the ones building it every day. In each episode, we'll go beyond the headlines to hear from industry insiders and bold, game-changing innovators to separate the hype from reality. So Haley, we're back. We're back for season 2 with our friends at EE Online. I'm really excited. It's post DTech, not to date ourselves with this episode, but it was a great DTech this year, right?
I thought it was fantastic, and I wasn't ready for it to be quite as good as it was, frankly. I was expecting to see a lot of the same old solutions and the same old things, but there were lots of new people, lots of new solutions that were unique. I was pretty excited by it, and met tons and tons of people, caught up with a bunch of people. Man, I love DistribuTech. I really do.
Me too. And because we love it so much, they added the day. So we had an extra day. I ran around. I don't know if you've been seeing it, but I've been videotaping. I was videotaping from the floor. We had a lot of really cool interviews with the innovators. One is on our show today, and I'm going to drop who that is in a second. We had a lot of fun recording all the interviews. So if you go to the InnovationForce YouTube page, you can catch up with some of those videos. We called it DTech Decoded, and we were able to highlight a lot of different spotlights around the top 10 challenges that we're helping the industry solve this year with, and we dropped this news with Association for Edison Illuminating Companies, Lee. So we have teamed up and we're helping working groups with Association for Edison Illuminating tackle these top 10 challenges this year. It's going to be like one a month.
Yeah, it's a great organization. They bring, I think, a couple of hundred utilities together in specialist areas so they could talk about solutions, talk about the problems they're seeing. And it's really a great thing about the utility industry is they're not really competing against each other, so they can share ideas and successes instead of feel like it's competition.
Absolutely. It's that peer collaboration that we know that makes this industry so great. And so for this episode, we're really going to target really that first challenge, which is our most commonly and frequently cited problem, which is driving reliability. So weather and wildfire resilient grids is probably going to be a lot of what we talk about today, but I'm sure we'll trickle into other challenge areas. But the big problem is really with the major storms and increasing strain on distribution systems across our country. Like we're seeing more hurricanes, wildfire, ice storm, snowstorms. A lot of my colleagues up in the Northeast are like 2 feet of snow. It snowed 6 inches a couple weeks ago here in Myrtle Beach, if you can believe that. This is causing a lot of problems for utilities. They have more frequent outages, and restoration is often slowed by the way that distribution circuits are configured. So even when there is available capacity on an adjacent feeder, transferring load can be difficult because of phase imbalance and voltage constraints. So this means capacity goes unused while customers are remaining in the dark. Lee, I don't know, does this sound familiar from your days?
Yes, and as a matter of fact, it is, other than safety, which is number one, it's the next thing that is focused on by utilities, next area they want to spend money on to help with resiliency and to help with reliability, which are different things, but we'll group them together for now.
Yeah.
Something interesting about what you said is when you have a major event like that, for many utilities, many of their metrics are not affected because they're considered special events. So they come out of those metrics, but they don't come out of people's heads. People remember those for a long time. So they are really, really important, even if they're not in the metrics. And I do feel bad for the utilities here because this was something they focused on well before we started getting all these crazy weather events. This has always been a focus area for utilities, but now they have this on top of that. They have these events happening, this crazy weather, and it's requiring a tremendous amount of investment, which I think we're going to hear about today, maybe how to lower that investment, but to still get the benefits. And at the same time this is happening, there's tremendous cost pressure on utilities to charge less to their customers. I think even President Trump mentioned it yesterday, the idea of keeping energy rates down. He did it with regards to data centers, but high rates are high rates, and they are affecting people's lives right now. So the utilities have a serious challenge ahead of them.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And so today we're going to talk about a way that utilities can use a brand new solution, or maybe a solution you haven't really heard of. It's a great solution that can restore power quickly and even under severe conditions. The desired outcome is to minimize outage duration, ensure critical services can be restored, and we're going to provide equitable resilience benefits across all communities. Fasten your seatbelts, my friends. We're about to find out what happens when you can improve restorations and deliver better resiliency with a pad-mounted power flow controller called Phase EQ by SwitchSource.
I'd like to take this opportunity to bring our guest forward, Charlie Murray, CEO and co-founder at SwitchSource. Charlie, welcome to Piloting the Future.
Yeah, thanks very much for having me today.
Yeah, no, it's our pleasure. I definitely want to learn more about the technology. We invested in Flizzr very early on at SDG&E, but it was very expensive. We could only do so many circuits. We had to run a pilot quite a while before we convinced ourselves it was worth it. So I'd love to hear how you've taken it to the next, or maybe even the next level. Can you tell us more about the company and how your solution, Phase EQ, works?
Yeah, absolutely. Our company is SwitchSource. We've been around for 9.5 years now, so we're pretty old as far as startups go. We like to think of ourselves as just an earlier stage company, and we're developing these solutions really targeted at distribution utilities. What makes us a little bit different is we play at that medium voltage primary level of the distribution grid. We love 15 kV, 25 kV class systems, kind of our bread and butter. And we are designing devices that can intelligently route power around at these voltage levels. Everything that we do is kind of focused on taking advantage of existing topologies of the distribution grid. And what we mean by that is we look at a typical distribution circuit, has a three-phase backbone, and it might have a bunch of single-phase laterals that are tapped off of it. And for those that aren't really in the know, we use three-phase power for bigger, beefier customers. So it might be your light industrial or heavy commercial customers, folks with heavy spinning loads or HVAC or cold storage, things like that. But the majority of customers on a distribution circuit by number are typically single-phase customers. These are like residential type customers. And so what we have is this kind of like high mix of single-phase loads with some three-phase loads as well. What we found is that by balancing out those single phase loads more evenly across the three phases of the backbone, you can actually increase the amount of load you can connect to a circuit by 10 to 25%. And when you can increase the amount of load you can connect to a circuit, you can bring chunks of load through Flizzr back online quicker. This is a tool that's meant to make the grid more flexible and make it easier to reconfigure the grid and restore service quicker.
So if a utility has not invested in Flizzr, if they don't have those switches, can they still use your solution?
Yes. And I would say the main benefit when you're looking at it outside of Flizzr and more blue sky conditions is increased load serving capability. So we're talking to a lot of utilities throughout the Northeast who are actually kind of waking up to the fact that electrification is not something that's going to happen in 10 or 20 or 30 years. It's happening right now. And so as they look at their distribution circuits, they're finding that they just don't have the headroom for the actual load that's showing up today. And where this shows up is if you go and talk to your distribution planners, they typically have this planning criteria for how much load they can have on the circuit. There's usually voltage constraints as well as thermal constraints. And in talking to some big name utilities, anywhere from 20 to 50% of their distribution circuits are outside of their planning criteria today. So that's something where in talking to these utilities, they might have it in their mind that like, oh yeah, we've got some pain points here or there. But when they actually survey the circuits and they're looking at it more from a data perspective as opposed to anecdotal, the numbers stack up really quick and there's a lot of distribution circuits running in the red.
There are utilities that have long lists of circuits that either have problems or will have problems. They're at 90%, and they try to slot them in to their capital budget. How many can we do each year? How much does it cost? And they do not like being in the red. They do not like being over. And so this is an incredible solution because they are capital constrained. They can only do so many a year. And what you're saying is you can take the whole list down 20, 25%.
That's right. That's the goal for this. And it kind of plays into that affordability aspect too here. You can either think about it as on a unit basis, we're going to take something that might cost, on the order of $1 million a mile from a system upgrade perspective. And we're going to, deploy a device like this, which might be at a cost point closer to a third of that, and get similar end results. So you can either think about it as like, hey, we're going to save 2/3 of the capital on this, or you can say, hey, we can take that same bucket of capital and we can now fix 3 circuits instead of 1. So that's the kind of math that we're trying to bring utilities around to, and we can talk more about how we're sharing the results of the existing projects we have and the traction with different utilities. But that's the punchline here is you can get similar benefits to reconductoring a circuit just by slapping a pad mounted device in the ground.
And some people might think utilities want to spend more capital on this, but they do have limited capital budgets. They have all kinds of cost pressure from regulators saying don't raise rates, customers are unhappy, and that's why they can't do them all in a year. They can't do all the ones they'd like to do. That's why there's a waiting list and a ranked order. And what you're really letting them do is get through that list, which is an incredible win.
Yes. I mean, we hear this again. It's like, oh, I'm 5, 6, 7 years behind on my capital upgrades, on my capacity upgrades. I mean, this is a pain point for utilities, and the projects are relatively complex, especially if you're thinking of building a new substation, building a new feeder. This isn't just a capital constraint, it's a human resources constraint too. Those projects gobble up a lot of resources inside of the utilities.
Let's get specific about that. Which utilities have you heard this from? Tell us about a successful deployment story that you've had.
Spill the beans, Charlie. Tell us.
So, we've worked with, I don't know if I should name specific names here, but we have published various C-grade papers and things like that with different utilities. And I'd encourage folks to either reach out to me and we can share those, or if you do some Googling, you'll find them pretty quickly. But in those projects, we're deploying this device to mitigate issues associated with overloading circuits as number one. And then, number two is supporting, FLISR. I would say we've also deployed units kind of co-located with larger distributed generation. So community scale solar, something on the order of megawatt, couple megawatts. And the nature of the power electronics devices is that they don't mind chasing around volatility out on these distribution circuits. And I think that's the main separator from this, as opposed to trying to tackle this with more of a manual approach. Is we go to a lot of utilities. It's a wide spectrum in terms of like how well they understand the system from a data perspective. And this isn't the fault of the utilities. It's just some of them don't have visibility about like what loads are connected to what phases, and do I have that cleanly in a model that I can go and access today. Part of what this device does is it's constantly measuring what the imbalance is and rebalancing. So you don't really need to have perfect information when you're sticking this box out on the field. You just have to know that you have an imbalance issue. And then it's going to be able to locally redistribute the load just by pushing electrons from phase to phase. And one key thing that I want to say about it, especially in the context of a lot that's been going on over the last couple of weeks with solid state transformers, is solid state transformers, for the most part, my understanding, I'd like to think I've got a pretty good understanding, they're inline devices. This is something that's taking the place of a traditional transformer, at different parts of the grid. What we are doing with this device is it's more of a compensator. So it sits in shunt with the circuit, almost like a capacitor bank sits in shunt with the circuit. Capacitor bank is there to try to supply VARs to be able to correct for reactive demands from inductive loads. What we are doing with this device is we are trying to essentially supply imbalanced current for those downstream loads so that you're not pulling all of that imbalanced current from the substation. And that's where a lot of these problems start to manifest, where you're overloading one phase, or you have big voltage drops on one phase and bad power quality for customers.
When I was at SDG&E, we used a compensator instead of a battery to try to help the effects of solar that was spiking the system. One thing about that, though, is it was very expensive. It turned out that a battery was almost the same price. Is this something that you think you also could do? And what is your cost comparison?
Yeah, so we aim to be significantly cheaper than energy storage. Maybe just a little bit on my background and why we started this thing in the first place. I was working for a large independent power producer, and I was actually trying to sell energy storage to utilities directly through bilateral agreements. And we had a pretty successful run building energy storage resources to participate in like the PJM fast regulation market, which was like really hot when it first came out. Then we went and tried to sell this to utilities. Again, this was 15 years ago, and ran into a number of roadblocks. At the time, regulatory, they weren't really excited about energy storage. It looked more like a generator. They were kind of concerned if the utility should really own it. There's the physical size aspect of it. There's the cost. There's the fire risk. All these things sort of played into utilities being hesitant. And when I was introduced to this technology, which was like the bedrock of switch source, the whole idea was like, we can create power flow control devices that are kind of like the front end of your energy storage system. So, the inverter for the energy storage system is what you're telling to kind of like pull power in and out of the battery. Well, instead of having the battery on the backside of it, what if you just had a part of the grid that's underutilized? So we're going to try to use a different wire or a different distribution circuit as the capacity. And then the front end is just the power electronics. So coming all the way back to the cost structure for this thing should be just the cost structure of the inverter part of the energy storage, which usually is something on the order of like 10 to 20% of the energy storage system, depending on how much duration of battery you have sitting behind it. So that's kind of how we think about the energy storage market. But again, going back to the sort of tool that's in the utility toolkit today, overhead, we're seeing new construction of overhead in kind of northeast area, also some places in the Midwest. You can spend $1 million a mile on new overhead. Same is true for doing line extensions. And a line extension is where you have a single phase corridor, but it's causing imbalance issues. You don't have a way to divvy up the load. So now you have to extend all 3 phases and then switch some of those services onto the new phases that you just installed. For us, even if it's just a half mile of that traditional upgrade, that should be more than price parity with what we're doing. We're going to offer something that's a lower cost point than a half mile of a traditional wires upgrade.
And a lot faster.
When you started deploying the technology, what surprised you? What did you learn?
We started deploying this with support from the Department of Energy and then through ARPA-E, and then also through an organization called NYSERDA, the New York State Energy Research Development Authority in upstate New York. We started off with a smaller utility. The sort of surprises that we had were really tied to how dynamic the device is. We have a lot of runtime on these devices now, and I think maybe it's obvious now, but like the distribution system, the actual power that's up there, it's not as clean as you might think. There's lots of voltage variations. There are little faults that pop up on the grid. Part of the difficulty of creating a device at this level of the grid is that I think it gets a lot of abuse. It's not sitting behind the meter, kind of protected from your panel, protected by whatever step down transformer you have. This is something that, a lot of times we're connected directly to overhead with a 3-phase cutout. And so we're up there getting the same abuse as that distribution circuit, whether it's like trees that are hitting it, balloons, whatever it might be that's causing that outage. We see it. Our uptime on our devices tends to be limited by the sort of voltage excursions and issues that we see popping up on the distribution circuits. I think we got a lot of visibility to that. And that was a steep learning curve for us too, about, how can we relax what we initially thought the constraints were for a good grid, for us to stay connected to it. Because part of our plan was like, if the grid looks like it's in an abnormal condition, we want to come offline. But we had to kind of expand what good looked like from a grid operating perspective, just because this part of the grid takes a lot of abuse.
This technology sounds so valuable for utilities. What's at risk if they don't deploy phase EQ?
I would say there's something that I've read about before called the tyranny of the urgent, where it's like we're so behind, we can't come up the learning curve on a new tool. And I think that there's a little bit of that trap right now with utilities, where it's like, it kind of feels like there's so much to do that we want to kind of rely on our old reliable tools for being able to deploy more capacity to the grid. And I think just from a cost perspective and from a timing perspective, we're going to see that there's a breaking point. Again, it seems like you're very well versed in this. It's like there's a long list of projects that need to get done. And right now, we are seeing more and more of these circuits sort of like run in the red by the traditional planning criteria that utilities use to make sure that they have a healthy system out there. This is going to come to a head at some point. And I think that with the load growth that we're seeing at distribution, we're going to continue to see nuisance faults because imbalance has gotten so bad it's tripping feeder breakers. We're going to continue to see that there's really long connection times for larger loads. And there's different reasons why utilities feel pain on this in different parts of the U.S. But I think we're going to see that reliability is going to take a hit, just as a function of not having the headroom to be able to reconfigure the grid.
So I'm a technical guy, but I know from experience that it's very important to look at it from different perspectives. How would a regulator understand this? How would a utility executive understand it? And most important, how would a customer look at this and understand it? Can you talk about it in that way?
Yes. Yeah, I think the easiest analogy that we use for this kind of at a high level is distribution utilities are really collections of these distribution circuits. And a distribution circuit is kind of like a 3-lane highway where there's barriers between the lanes. And the traffic, the actual cars, are those electrons. And so what utilities figured out a long time ago is the most cost-effective way to actually get power to people is not to deliver 3 lanes to everybody's doorstep, but to kind of peel off 1 lane and sort of an off-ramp that goes to a different area. And this is that sort of like single phase lateral. So to tie this back for a distribution circuit might be 5 to 10 miles long, but it might have 30, 50, 70 miles of single phase laterals kind of tapped off. It's fairly complex. And there's really no way to balance that traffic. So those off ramps are pretty fixed. So what we decided is like, it would be great if we could balance out that traffic. Come up with a tool that goes about halfway down, the circuit or the highway in this analogy, and then enables those cars to change lane to lane and can do it in real time. So that's how we think about distribution circuits and kind of our role in terms of equalizing that traffic. Once you do that, you can increase the amount of cars that you can have, flowing down this backbone by anywhere from 10 to 25%.
It's too bad you don't have that solution for cars and highways. That would be pretty great.
That's right.
Making sure lanes were balanced and the people were smoothly getting on and off. If cars were only electrons.
Yes.
When you're measuring success, what metrics really matter that show you're driving business benefit?
I would say that the main thing that we come back to is still the amount of capacity that we're unlocking. And it's actually really easy for us to understand this. We look at key criteria in terms of, how many amps, what those limiting, amps are or current is on a particular phase. We look at what we call, bellwether meters for understanding what the voltages look like across a distribution circuit. So typically there are different parts of a distribution circuit with those sort of worst performers from a voltage perspective. And we can do very easy on-off tests for this device. The device doesn't require any sort of external connection or communication in order to operate, but a lot of utilities do choose to connect it to SCADA. And one of my favorite projects was in Georgia, where they initially connected it through SCADA. And this was just last year through the heat dome that they had. And we were able to do on-off testing on both a day-to-day basis as well as a week-to-week basis through that stretch of very high heat and very high load. And when you look at the data, it is just so stark, the difference with this device on versus off. The other thing that I think was a little bit surprising for us, going back to a previous question, is we didn't realize that we were going to have such a big impact that even when the device is installed 3 miles away from the feeder head, you still see the results at the feeder head. You mentioned that different utilities have different amounts of data that they're getting off their circuits. Most of them that we work with today have some amount of telemetry or information at the feeder head. And the second you turn this device on, you see that correction and imbalance all the way back to the feeder head. So that's what we look at mostly is, again, those traditional criteria for how much capacity do I have on the circuit or how much ampacity or headroom do I have on the circuit.
That is so exciting. So how does the solution help integrate more renewables?
When we started out as a company, we thought a lot about this, and it had to do with interconnection upgrade costs, because a lot of the renewable energy developers, and then we also saw the same issues with electric vehicle charging developers or companies.
Well, that I get, because that's just another load that you can help balance. That I understand.
It's the same constraints, really. So when you try to interconnect those renewables, a lot of times what we'll see is those renewables are pushing different voltages or currents outside of those planning criteria. And again, the sort of like crash course here in distribution planning is the utility's job is to make sure that customers have access to power within a certain voltage range at their meter, and to make sure that they're not overloading any of the equipment that they have in that delivery system up to that point and be able to accommodate that load, right? That's very reductive, but that, at the core, that's what we think about with these distribution planners. So those criteria tend to be, voltages or thermal constraints that all of a sudden trigger, $1 million upgrades. And it really comes back to usually voltage gets triggered first. And so we see that a lot of utilities have voltages that are kind of eking closer and closer to those ANSI required limits. And the second that you put distributed generation, it has a tendency to kind of push those voltages either higher. We see that a lot. There's kind of like a reverse voltage drop sort of phenomenon that happens when you're trying to inject power back into the grid. Where we like to start from is, if you think about the tools that utilities are typically using, they tend to be ganged on a 3-phase basis, meaning, they have either a load tap changer at the substation, which can move all 3 phases up. They might have a capacitor bank that also is looking at maybe one phase of the three phases of voltage and then making decisions about how all three phases from a capacitor bank perspective should operate based on information from one of those phases. When you have a device that suddenly collapses or draws the phases closer together, all those other devices start performing a little bit better. What we typically see is there's one phase that is the limiting factor for a lot of that DG interconnect. And by kind of making the system more balanced from a three-phase perspective, you're getting more leverage out of those other devices you have and able to accommodate more distributed generation.
Those capacitor banks are taking a lot more wear and tear because of distributed energy, because of clouds coming in and voltage going up and down. If you can take that off their plates, that's a huge help.
It is. One of the, again, like coming back reminds me of one of these like surprising things that we saw is when you're balancing out the loading, you're providing more load diversity across the three phases, and you're actually using two phases as a shock absorber for a third phase. So the other thing that we see in the data here is, this is not like a StatCom where we're just, injecting or consuming bars with a some sort of like switch device. We are exchanging real power from phase to phase. And we have that same stabilization effect, is that it does tend to stabilize the voltage because you're able to lean on the other two phases and do it on a dynamic basis.
Okay, this is great. Thank you so much. Okay, so we're going to move to the visionary's take. And this is where I like to say we're going to cut through the BS and really think about how can we get out of pilot hell and into production paradise. Because Charlie, like, I love this. I love, how you've come up with a new way to solve a lot of old problems. And it just sounds so much easier to install, faster to deploy, more affordable, and all of the benefits, and some of the benefits, frankly, that were promised to us from other types of devices, which you were mentioning, other ways to deliver power electronics, which is, I'm thinking of volt-var devices back in the day. I'm thinking about, like you were talking about, solid state transformers. So let's talk about how can we take this new way of working that you've come up with and remove some of those obstacles that you're seeing so that we can get this out there to, load growth, reliability, data centers coming, renewables. This just seems like such a great piece of equipment to be putting out quickly.
There's some really great things that we've seen out there that certain utilities or certain states are doing where they're providing a little bit more visibility in terms of system utilization. And you're going back to, our device is using a different part of the system as the capacity as opposed to energy storage. Regulators have a pretty good understanding of energy storage. And I would say some of them right now are really pushing the utilities to say, what does your system utilization look like? But more from a time series perspective. And I think there's a more fundamental question that we could ask at the regulatory level and then also at the utilities, which is, what does our system utilization look like, on an instantaneous basis? So if they look at their peak loading and they look at this, sort of heat map of their circuits, some utilities have actually published that. And what you end up finding is that there are circuits that are more heavily loaded than others. There's the opportunity to equalize them there. And we're not talking about adding a ton of capacity to do that. It's really sort of like the power electronics infrastructure to be able to balance out those, unbalances in terms of, or imbalances in terms of load and demand. I think part of it is visibility, and there's some great examples of utilities that have published that data and are kind of on the forefront of it. Mm-hmm. It's used a little bit to guide folks like EV charging developers so they know where they should go and try and put an EV charging station without incurring really long, lead times for an interconnection. So I think that is something that's important. I think the other thing, though, that we find is inside utilities when we work with them, we do need support still from sort of senior level folks to kind of champion these types of technologies. We tend to have a really high success rate when we're going out for that first project, working with distribution planners and with operators because they know their trouble circuits from an imbalance perspective. Like they can tell you, I was out there manually balancing the circuit in the summer. And then, 6 months later, winter peak, I was rebalancing it again because I optimized it for one part of the year, not for the other. And now I have the same problem showing up again and customers calling me with issues. That's one of these examples where it's like, hey, this is a really high pain point at a sort of like unit level. And then the next step for us working with the utilities is say, perform this sort of survey where you look and understand how broad this problem is. That is the eye opener. And that's hard for us to do, because a lot of the utilities don't necessarily want to share all of their system planning files. That's proprietary, but they have to put the work in to kind of understand how broad this problem is. And it is pervasive within utilities. And it's an extreme problem as you get to more rural utilities because they have longer single phase laterals, they have more complex circuits. And then, we see it still though with suburban. So I would say anywhere from like 20 to 50% of their, of a utility circuits. And you think about a decent sized utility, we're talking about hundreds of circuits. When you tie that with the amount of capacity that can be unlocked, we're talking about a peaker plant worth of capacity that's distributed throughout the distribution system that you can unlock just with pad mounted devices. That sort of messaging is also important for us to get a little bit louder about. We are talking about something that's hundreds of megawatts of extra load serving capacity that we can, in a year, unlock with a series of pad mounted devices.
Oh, totally. I mean, this is a shovel ready solution that can go now. And I'm even thinking about, when you were mentioning the rural, I'm thinking about electric co-ops, and a lot of the electric co-ops are the ones that are seeing the data center growth. Because where are we putting the data centers? In these areas where we have a lot of land, right? And they're trying to figure out how in the world am I supposed to connect all this extra capacity that the data center needs. So it feels to me like this would be perfect for them as well to handle these capacity problems, but it's going to be a lot faster. It's going to be affordable. It's going to reduce the truck rolls. It's going to improve the voltage quality. So I was kind of curious of your take on that. Are you seeing demand? Where are you seeing it from?
Yeah, I would say we see a decent amount of demand from co-ops and then smaller municipally owned utilities. Part of it is these are teams that don't necessarily have a team of 10 engineers that can do due diligence on a new technology. And so, although I think there's like a lot of pride in the work that they do, and they're doing a lot of hard engineering work, taking on a new technology can be a little bit tricky. So we have done some demonstration projects. We did a great demonstration project where we actually had to co-locate 2 units because there was such severe imbalance. This was with a co-op in West Texas. And then we did another project that's with a co-op in Alaska that really test the device under some pretty extreme conditions. And, that was another one that was really exciting for us, but very long circuits. The longer those circuits are, the more costly the alternative tends to be for just doing the reconductoring, because you're just doing more miles of it. So we do see that there's a market there. I would say, as a smaller, business with limited personnel ourselves, we spend a lot more time chasing opportunities where a utility has 300, 400, 500 circuits that we could go and deploy the technology to. So I would say it's more a self-imposed constraint at this point in time that we're talking more to the investor-owned utilities, but we have done really successful projects with the co-ops. It's just a little trickier to get it to scale.
Totally. I'm thinking about partnerships for you guys as you talk. What I'm thinking of is partnering closer with the data centers, potentially partnering closer with some of those software tools that the distribution system planners are using, because they're projecting these forecasts at wide levels that then you slot what you guys are doing right in. It's fantastic. I know we spent a lot of time understanding the technology, so I really do want to move to the rapid seat. But I guess I would say maybe make an appeal to everyone listening to this podcast. What is one thing we can help you with, Charlie? Because we love what you're doing. Is there one thing that maybe somebody listening could do to help you get this out there?
Yeah, I mean, I think, again, kind of helping us understand, how we kind of align ourselves maybe with more of the programmatic needs of utilities. So I think there are utilities out there that are interested in more affordable solutions. We've seen utilities, really adopting virtual power plants. One of the challenges for us is how do we fit into that landscape? We definitely don't consider ourselves energy storage. We definitely do consider ourselves a utility-owned asset. And then there's these other names out there, grid enhancing technology or non-wires alternative. It's sometimes a little bit difficult for us to kind of find our place there. So I would say if there are opportunities for us to sort of educate folks on the technology, why this is such a great tool, spreading the word about the projects that we've done and how utilities are using us.
I think most utilities have a list of circuits that need
They all do.
They all need more capacity or that are in the danger zone, and there's a person responsible for that list.
Yeah. And I was going to just one last question, and I want to move the hot seat. I was wondering about how is standards? Are they getting behind this? Is that an extra barrier, or is that an accelerant for you?
I would say it changes utility to utility. For the most part, The standards teams are really focused on, operationally, is this going to be a thorn in my side in the next 5, 10, 20 years? And then also, is it safe? We have gotten through that sort of safety discussion, and we work with a lot of manufacturers that kind of help us with the front end of our technology that have been making utility equipment for 60 and 70 years. All of those, types of things in terms of creating a safe enclosure, making sure that the interface points, those medium voltage connections, are all up to existing IEEE standards. We've got that in the bag. And that's another thing, just to tell you an interesting anecdote, or at least I think it's interesting, is most power electronics equipment that you'll see out there is painted white, and that's because we're trying to get heat off of the power electronics. We're not trying to actually get heat load onto the boxes, because it's so important for us to have something that looks and feels like traditional utility equipment. We're still painting this thing dark green. Not a week goes by that my engineers don't ask me hey, can we paint it in a different color yet? And it's no, we haven't gotten to that point that standards and everybody at the utility is really comfortable with this. I will, I can make the ask again, but they're probably going to say it has to be green. There's little things like that we choose to do to make folks a little bit more comfortable with it. And again, I would say most of the emphasis is just, hey, on the front end of this thing, I want this to look and feel like traditional utility equipment. And we feel like we've done a pretty good job at that.
Yeah, it does. Exactly. It blends right in.
Yes, that's right.
Lee, let's get started on the hot seat. I know we're running a little late on this one. I know Charlie probably has to go. So
these are really interesting questions right now. There's a lot going on. So question number one, in 5 years, the biggest challenge for the grid is?
I think it's going to be power quality. I just think we're going to continue to see high volatility loads, and we're seeing it already. And I think it's gonna be power quality, and who's gonna own that?
I mean, that's a good one. And I have complained about that probably for 10 years when I was back in a sensor company. That will remain nameless right now. Yeah, I think the biggest challenge, and you and I talk about this a lot in the hot seat, I'm going to take one of yours, Lee, from a couple of podcasts ago, is affordability. Quick. We need to be quick and affordable right now, or we are going to be falling behind.
Well, I've had an awakening, okay? At DistribuTech, for those people I talk to, it suddenly started occurring to me, and I know a lot of people were ahead of me on this, how many people at DistribuTech might not have jobs in the future because of how much of the work that I'm aware of that happens at the utility. It seems like it can be done by AI. My daughter is a software developer, and 6 weeks ago, she had her first real taste in a business setting of leveraging AI. It was able to find a bug and fix it in minutes that had been taking hours. And then it taught her and her mentor what they were doing wrong, explain the bug to them. So it did more than just fix it. It actually was able to teach. Since that time, and again, it's only been weeks, people in the company are very nervous because they can see that they can code using AI in a tenth the time. And when you can code in a tenth the time, yes, you can do 10 times as much, you can go 10 times as fast, but you can also get away with 1/10 as many people. And I think management's going to have to figure that out. I think that as that happens, this is how it's going to impact the grid. First of all, you're going to get huge loads, which everybody is talking about, that you're going to have to figure out how to get energy to, and they're in different places than the load necessarily is right now. And then traditional places where you have load, there's a lot of office buildings that require a lot of HVAC and a lot of equipment. I think they're going to have less people, and they're going to have less need for that as much HVAC locally like that. And so that removes energy from that location. I think that's going to be a huge problem for the grid. It's going to be very costly potentially. Potentially there's great cost savings that you can happen, but you're going to need some way to solve that. And maybe this solution actually can help. But I will now move to the biggest challenge instead for the utilities. So we talked about the grid. What is the challenge for the utilities?
Yeah, and I'll jump in there. I mean, I think it's adopting some of these new tools, specifically grid enhancing technologies, implementation of the VPPs. It does not appear as though we're on a trajectory to meet the capacity needs of the next 10, 20, 30 years. And it feels like we have to bring new tools to bear.
Yep, I would echo that. I feel like this is why we started this podcast, was because we couldn't get deployments going fast enough. There's a whole new set of names, companies, faces, and types new ways of thinking about old problems, which this is a great example of. And so if we can't adopt this technology fast enough, and we're an industry that is usually not really used to adopting new technology fast, I think we need to think a little bit harder about our innovation programs, our standards departments, and how we can be a little more agile. As Linda Hill would say, we need to have some practice creative agility here and create experimentation and safe places to learn, because we're only going to learn by putting this stuff out there. We're not going to do it in a way that's going to be break fix, but we can do it in a safe way where we can learn and share those learnings, as we started this podcast talking about, collaboratively in a peer-to-peer way. And it's that peer-to-peer networking that's going to be invaluable for us. And it could be maybe the way that we could get ahead of, Charlie's prediction that we won't be able to keep up with capacity. Well, perhaps we will if we can work peer-to-peer.
I agree with the two of you very much on this. And the different angle I have is really, I'm going to say the word culture. I've had 3 calls this week already. What is it? Wednesday. I've had 3 calls with companies that I advise about the fact that they can't find anybody that is willing to stick their neck out on something new in the utilities that they're talking to. And the thing is, they are finding people that understand the tech and that definitely see the value. Like, there are people excited, but even though they're excited, they know that traditionally at many utilities, not all, but the way to get ahead is to say yes and to just go with IBM. Back in the day, you can't get fired for going with IBM, even if it's the wrong call. And that culture has to change so that these technologies can get out there.
And I want to add something real quick, because I want to plug Linda Hill's latest book, her new book about scaling genius. Genius at Scale is the real name of the book. But it's about, what role are you coming in as? Are you a catalyst? Lee, it sounds like you've been talking to a lot of catalysts this week. These are people that have, Charlie's a catalyst. You got a new idea, a new way of working. If you're a catalyst, you got to find a bridger. The bridgers are the ones that own the relationships and can help get risk mitigated by compromising and seeing both sides. And then you need great architects. And Lee, you were an architect back in the day. Larry Beckadall, great example of another architect. Sadly, saw on LinkedIn today that he is officially retiring.
Yes.
The senior leaders that had the ability to create great programs where innovation could flourish. We need great architects. Architects that are going to create the legacy and support a really good space for these new catalysts coming online, and all the bridgers out there that are going to be able to help these new ideas get adopted inside of the utilities in a risk-free way, or lower the risk for that.
Charlie, you've been out there. You've learned a lot. What's the biggest myth that you want to bust about power electronics?
Yeah, I think some people have experience with power electronics from 20 or 30 years ago, and some others have experience with power electronics, maybe from the solar inverter or energy storage inverter world, which is kind of where I started as well. Power electronics can be designed in various different ways. And I would say, especially with regards to energy storage or solar plants, there's some assumption that there's going to be somebody nearby to turn a wrench on it. And I think for distribution utilities especially, we're trying to figure out how to drive out every bit of OpEx that we can. Power electronics can be designed to have little to no operational expenditures or maintenance associated with them. And you do have to beef them up. You have to be able to beef up the power electronics to a point that you're using different thermal management. It's more reliable. It doesn't require somebody to come out and touch the system. But I would say that the power electronics that we are fielding and that we're seeing some others field, fantastic uptime. I would say getting close to those sort of like solid state, just regular, boring, old iron and copper transformers without fans spinning on them. And I think that is something that is very different from the power electronics people might have had experience with 30 years ago.
That is great. Hey, Kim, you want to wrap it up?
I sure do. If you found this conversation helpful or inspiring, share your own bold prediction and tag InnovationForce on LinkedIn. Share someone, a company, an innovator that's helping shape our energy future. We want to know about them. They might be our next guest on the show. And of course, we want you to check out SwitchSource at www.switchsource.com. Check them out. Lots of great information at their website. And of course, you can find them in the InnovationWorks hangar, where we have matched SwitchSource and their separate use cases to well over 50, 60 challenges at this point that we've seen in our grid filings analysis. So be sure to check it out. And of course, follow us on LinkedIn. check out my interview with Charlie from D-Tech at YouTube at InnovationForce's YouTube channel. Thank you, Lee. I think it's time we can fasten our seatbelts. We learned a lot today. Bring this big bird in for her landing.
Yeah, the world's changing fast, so get out there and